Howdy, Rose, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called The Life of Interpretation. And this is a product of a reading group I've had the honor and joy of being a part of with Davood, Gozli, and John David on the Tropics of Discourse by Hayden White. Tropics of Discourse. You see, during this whole discussion series, I never quite got that right. So, Tropics of Discourse. We've been doing it for about 6 months, and this paper is following after another paper called The Novel Historian that really focused on the beginning of the collection, and this paper is going to be following the rest of it. I think what's really important to understand is that Mr. White believes that history is unavoidable when it comes to understanding ourselves and our societies, and also interpretation is unavoidable because wherever there's understanding, there has to be interpretation. Facts don't tell us what they mean. We have to decide what they mean, and we have to arrange them, and so on and so forth. And for him, if we were to actually embrace this role of interpretation, it might actually save history departments. He thinks the study of history is in decline. He writes, "In my view, history as a discipline is in bad shape today because it has lost sight of its origins in the literary imagination. In the interest of appearing scientific and objective, it has repressed and denied to itself its own greatest source of strength and renewal." So here Mr. White is saying that by history trying to be more scientific or to present itself like as a science, it's actually lost all of its power. It's lost its literary imagination. And he will reference people like Tocqueville and Hegel as examples of a more literary historical account. And for him, it's precisely by embracing this literary dimension that you can save history and also too. But you see, one of the reasons we don't want to do that is because interpretation is quite difficult. And how do you go about interpretation? And what do you even studying if you just if all at the end of the day it is interpretation? So there's a lot of, it seems like you're just entering into a giant relativistic mess. But you see, it's very important that we understand that what constitutes interpretation is in fact literary, and interpretation is not anything goes. So there's three main moves I think that we need to understand that's going on in Mr. White. He's going to acknowledge that history entails interpretation. He wants us to do the same. And then he's going to bind the range of that interpretation with the very principles and laws one goes about by making a good interpretation. And do note that there's a big difference between just saying history's interpretation and that's it, versus saying history is interpretation and we need to figure out how to carry out good interpretation. It's very similar to literature. Sure, anyone can interpret Dostoevsky however they want, but not all interpretations are equally justified or equally backed by the text. That gets into the art of interpretation and how to go about that. And as discussed in The Novel Historian, once you allow interpretation into your thinking, that's going to also introduce the necessity of dialectics between historical accounts, between genres that we can, he's going to talk about the difference between, understanding the revolution, say the French Revolution in terms of irony, versus in terms of romanticism. There are different genres, there's these different ways of implotment, that you need to dialectically have discuss, go back off one another, bounce off one another, and how that actually elevates history once we do that. But you see, if historians just keep denying that there's any role of interpretation, you can never reach that dialectic, which you can have, where you can have a new historical renaissance. But you see, this is difficult because there's something about saying that history is a science that makes it feel more solid, makes it feel like it has more legitimacy. We see like literature and the humanities seem to be in crisis right now, and that's arguably part of because we think they're just subjective, that they don't teach anything solid. But actually, they seem like they don't teach anything solid because we haven't learned the skills and art of interpretation, which once you learn those, you start realizing that there is something very solid there. The issue is that interpretation, in order to do well, is extraordinarily interdisciplinary. Like a novel, for example, has characters, which means it has psychology, which means it also has desires, it also has wants, it has settings, which means it has a world, therefore it has a history and sociology and geography and physics and all these different things. Like a story is full of basically all the fields. It's radically interdisciplinary. And you see, Arguably, one of the reasons why it's so easy to think that interpretation means that there's nothing there is because in order to really get how interpretation arises to a solid interpretation, you have to be very interdisciplinary. You have to think through all of the different facets and the psychological state, say, of historical actors or characters in a novel. You have to think through those in order to give rise to plausible understandings of why the story went the way that it did, or why the historical account unfolded the way that it did. So there's something really interdisciplinary about it. So funny enough, if you're just studying, let's say you're in a history department and you're just studying history, well, you're going to possibly be cut off from all the other departments so that you can become interdisciplinary enough to do history in a manner that is interpretive but doesn't feel radically relativist. Well, if everything in college today specializes, focuses on specialization, then none of us are going to be interdisciplinary enough. So I don't think it's by chance that the rise of the specialist has corresponded with a feeling that interpretation undermines a discipline, and therefore there'd be a hesitancy to accept interpretation as playing a role, even though that's not true. And White gives a lot of reasons for why there has to be interpretation in history. For example, he says that the historical record is both too full and too sparse. We can't possibly include every fact and detail that could possibly be included about the Civil War in an account about it, and yet at the same time we lack details about the exact time and place General Grant ate breakfast on certain days. It's kind of funny. It's similar to how we live our own days. Like right now, this room I'm sitting in, I can't possibly recount every detail, every shade of the light, every single color that I am experiencing. And at the same time, you wouldn't, if I did that and gave you a full account, it would probably overwhelm you and it wouldn't mean anything to you. So I've got way too many details, so I have to organize the details of this room to something that matters or that you care about. So if somebody asks you, how was your day? We do the same thing. We know that when they ask, how was your day? They don't want to know every single detail. They want to know the main details. But sometimes people just answer, it was fine, thinking that the main point is that their day was fine, that they got through, and that can seem like it's not enough. So there has to be some structuring, some sort of organization of the historical account. Likewise, there has to be a structuring of our day. So it makes sense. So that means we have to structure it. But the moment we structure the facts of our days or emphasize some things versus other, well, then we've carried out interpretation because we've judged that X fact is more important than Y fact. Wherever there's judgment, there's going to be interpretation, at the very least an interpretation of value, of weight. And the historian simply cannot avoid this. They cannot avoid saying that that some facts are more valuable than others. Once they do that's an interpretation. Now, critically, that doesn't mean they're wrong. We've made a big mistake by assuming that where there's interpretation, there's error, or that there's just subjectivity. We can't say that the presence of subjectivity necessitates the presence of mistake. That's a big error. It's similar to the mistake of thinking that we only have true knowledge if we have certainty. Well, certainty is very rare in this life, but that doesn't mean we can't get confidence. The quest for certainty, I guess, that starts with Descartes, is unnecessary. We can have confidence. So likewise, interpretation, we can have confidence through interpretation, even if we can't have certainty. But we don't need certainty in order to operate. We just need confidence, as discussed throughout The True Isn't the Rational trilogy by O.G. Rose that we wrote. Another way to put this is in the same way that David Hume taught us we can never move from is to oughtness, although I try to complexify this in the paper Dialectical Ethics. Similarly, we can never move from a collection of facts to a story. The moment we have a story, which would be any ordering of facts or information in a manner that we can understand and that is meaningful to us. But the moment we do that, we have judgment, interpretation, and cognition involved. And John David made the great point where basically wherever there's history, wherever there's narrative, there's cognition. There's a cognitive act. So basically if we understand history, then interpretation is involved. Because someone must have arranged the historical facts in a manner that we can understand. If we just had free-floating facts, like some sort of chronicle. We wouldn't understand how to position them or how to weigh them or what to think of them. There has to be a judgment. There has to be an interpretation involved. And if X facts are presented to us about the American Civil War, even in a free-floating chronicle structure, whoever assembled those facts had to judge those as more important facts than other facts. But maybe the breakfast that General Grant had one morning was why he was feeling sick, and therefore a battle went a certain way. So therefore what he ate for breakfast one morning might be important. Hard to say. There has to be judgments involved. So wherever there is sense, meaning, and understanding, something is left out. It's similar to the classic problem of the map isn't the territory. A map that was a perfect replication of its territory would be unusable. You couldn't understand it. So maps are useful precisely because they are not equal to territories. They're not full accounts, but that means they're abstractions. In the same way, that historical accounts, if we understand them, must be incomplete. They must be leaving some things out. Now, I think there's also existential reasons why we don't like accepting the role of interpretation, in addition to the fact that if we are all specialists, we don't have the interdisciplinary training to understand interpretation as not having to be radically relativist. I think there's also this idea that if something can be interpreted, then it can be reinterpreted. And that would mean our understanding of World War II, we'd always have to hold with an open hand. Someone could come along and completely change our understanding of World War II. And, if our grandfather fought in World War II and we think that it was a good war, and someone comes along and could possibly unveil to us that the activities of the Allies in the Pacific theater were immoral or something, that could threaten our self-identity. And so there's something about interpretation that makes us vulnerable and could also change our origin, or they could reassemble our understanding of the United States of America or things that happen in the world. So it feels scary, and we don't really like that. Also, when something is scientific, it feels like it can be more democratic. And this, I think, is explored by Kindly Inquisitors by Jonathan Routs, which is a very good book. And he goes through this whole, and it's talked about in other papers, this whole point where he says that science, although science often feels elitist, like the elitist scientists are the only ones who know these ideas, basically the whole point of the scientific method is to create a conclusion that not simply scientists would see, but anyone would see if they went and did that experiment. The person becomes accidental, to use Aristotle's term, secondary. Anyone could go in and get the same results. So the results of science are very, very democratic. Anyone can go in as long as they carry out the experiment and see it. So it feels much more open, much more inviting to people. But once you start talking about interpretation, well, that arguably gets into an elitist education where you have to have time to read all the books, you have to learn how to be interdisciplinary, you have to learn how to judge facts, which is arguably, you then have to get into value, how do you value facts, and that might get into epistemology and philosophy, and that feels much more elitist or specialized, a special skill, I guess. It feels much more elitist, and it feels less democratic. So, that's going to also maybe be a reason we don't like accepting interpretation, because it would suggest a need for everyone to be, Renaissance people almost, and that feels like a very, very big pill to swallow. How much nicer would it be if history could in fact be science, and then you give all the public the information of history, and even if they themselves don't go in and do the historical studies, they could have confidence to know that if they did, they would find the same results, in the same way that we can be similarly confident that if we went in and did the science experiment, we would get the same results as the scientist. So we just don't want to accept. There's something about accepting interpretation that makes it much more, we can't be specialized, we have to be interdisciplinary. And if White succeeds, if it's true, following like Derrida and these other people, that every act of cognition just about, except raw perception or raw thinking, just thinking itself, if basically every act of comprehension involves interpretation, well, goodness, then basically all understanding requires us to be very interdisciplinary. And arguably, it's not very, and if that's the case, then it's not as democratic. And that's a hard pill to swallow, so we can understand why we might not be so eager when we might want things to be scientific that are not scientific. I stress the point, we tend to associate science with elitism and authority, but the scientific method, and arguably once you get into like theoretical science, stuff starts to change. But if we're talking about the scientific method, there is something about the scientific method that I think Rauch makes this point very clear and successfully. That is far more democratic. But again, it's just simply not the case that information, if it's coherent, is presented to it as just facts. And the images, you have these pointillist paintings, pointillism, which is you just make a dot, you make another dot, you make a bunch of dots, and then when you step back from all the dots, you see a painting. So you're just making these dots, but in the end, they come together and make a big image. Well, it's kind of hard to believe if you were to step back from one of these paintings and you were to see something that you could make sense of, an image, to then, if the artist told you, oh, I didn't have any idea what I was doing, I was just making dots, I didn't have an agenda, I didn't have any final image I wanted to make, well, you would know that couldn't be true. If you saw all these dots come together to make an image, there would have had to have been a plan. Well, very similarly, if the historian brings together a historic account that makes sense, there had to be a plan. There had to be a design. There had to be some sort of emplotment, to use Mr. White's language, because all the dots came together to make an image. So it's just not the case that accounts that make sense are just facts. And, a few more things. If maybe this room I was sitting in were to directly come out of the Big Bang, let's say the Big Bang was like 1 minute ago and boom, just this room came into existence. Well, then just the facts of this room would constitute the historical accounts of this room, because just a minute ago there was the Big Bang. But, once you go through time and history and get away from the Big Bang, then you can't really say that all of the facts that compose this room can in of themselves offer the total explanation of the entire space-time reality that gave rise to it. You would have to go beyond this room, and then you would have to get into why the facts assembled as such. So unless a moment in space-time is literally the only point of space-time, because it's like directly out of the Big Bang, like just a minute ago, then it's not the case that just the facts of that situation will constitute the whole understanding of that situation. The moment you're in time, just the facts will not capture it. There's going to have to be a bigger account, but the moment there's a bigger account, there has to be thinking beyond the facts, which would be acts of cognition, acts of understanding the psychology that, say, gave rise to the room, who constructed the room, why they constructed the room, what their motivations were. Well, then you have to get into all the minds of all those workers who made the room. If, on the other hand, the room just came out of the Big Bang, you could avoid all of that thinking on psychology and motives and so on and so forth. And that would get us into cognitive states, and cognitive states are not facts. Another issue here is that, funny enough, although we tend to think of facts as fundamental to existence, really human beings don't live facts. We live events. We never just live facts. We're always encountering events. The events come before the facts. Like, I see the light bulbs, I see this entire room, I see this computer, and then maybe I can try to garner or gather the facts about this computer. But the facts come after the phenomenological experience, after the impression of the laptop, and then the event of the experience of the laptop occurs, and then the facts. So there's this funny way that it's only by exploring the human experience, which would get us into cognition and beyond the facts, that we can actually get toward the event, the historic event, which was what was more real for the people at the time of the historic event than the historic facts. So if we're just describing the historic facts, we're not really even describing what people lived or experienced. We have to get into the historic event. But events are very interdisciplinary, like the event of this laptop in front of me right now. It's got colors, it's got computer chips inside of it, a video camera, it's got all these different parts that make it up. It's not just one thing, and also understanding how it came into existence, what were the motives of the person. That would get into capitalism, economics, the invention of the technology. This laptop is not just merely the facts, the facticity that compose it, but the event of which gave rise to it. So that makes it, but that's history. Everything in history is more so an event than a collection of facts, and that's quite difficult. Another way to look at what Mr. White wants us to do when we say he wants us to be radically interdisciplinary is it's almost like there's a really great creative writer teacher His name is Robert Butler. He's extraordinary, and he wrote this book called Where Dreams May Come, I think is what it was called. And he really goes into how the writer really wants to describe without judging events. Like, they want to describe their setting for the reader. But this is really actually very difficult. It seems easy to describe this room. Or let's say I have someone who is running across a field, and I'm writing a story, and I say, the boy ran across the field. Is that a description? Well, there's a lot of... This is Olson's point, Butler's point, is that actually very often when we think we're describing, we're actually judging. Because the word ran actually is a kind of judgment. I have decided that the boy running across the field is moving fast enough to constitute running, as opposed to, say, jogging or walking quickly. There is actually a judgment in the word ran. And if there's a judgment, there is subjectivity, and thus interpretation, because I have judged that the rate of movement of the boy constitutes running. A description would be the boy in the field lifted his leg, bending his knee at a 30-degree angle and plopped his foot down into the mud with his next step as he hurried to the house. So right there, I did end up with a judgment on hurried, but Mr. Butler wants us to have way more description in our account. And basically a way to look at White is that White is encouraging historians to write more like writers, kind of as Butler is describing, to avoid judgments. He thinks historians have way more judgments in their writing than they realize, and it's almost as if that White would like everyone to take a class with Butler. It's almost like White would like historians to get trained in the art of Butler. But, historians are certainly not going to do that, nor are we going to do that. I mean, everything that White is saying about historians could apply just as well to us as human beings. Because if all interpretation is cognitive and involves implotment or assembling facts, then we ourselves need to get better at interpretation, which means we all need to be better interdisciplinary generalists, and to realize and to pay way more attention to what we say and what we claim, to note if we're judging without realizing it. When we think we're describing, but really we're judging, we need to get better. So, I mean, what we learn in Butler, I think we all could learn from, and really should. And yes, in this situation, it's more pointed by Mr. White at historians, but it applies just as well to all of us. If indeed Derrida and people like that are correct, that all knowledge, all understanding entails an element of interpretation. Now, the rest of the collection is that Mr. White's going to go through. He's going to talk about the wild man. He's going to talk about rationality in history, Vico, Foucault, all these different people. And he's going to expand out, and there's a way in which toward the end of the Tropics of Discourse, it kind of seems like these essays are random. But really, Mr. White, it becomes clear at the end, has an intention, an overarching design. When he talks about rationality, if we think that history is rational, he talks about how historical accounts tend to not include irrational episodes, almost as if there's an efficient history hypothesis, kind of like the efficient market hypothesis, the idea that the market is always rational. Therefore, whatever results it gives us are rational, are the best. That capitalism is rational. Well, in a similar way, White is concerned that we've designed history just including rational action, and that's going to lead it in the direction of seeming scientific, because all you have to do is trace out the rational action. But White wants to point out that the human element is what creates history, and we can't just think of the human element in terms of rational. Humans are also irrational, and Lorenzo and I will talk about non-rational. Humans are also non-rational, which means they do things that might be really good ideas but can't be understood purely within a rational framework. They can be non-rational. But if we design history to only take into account rational actors, then it's going to seem like history is always rational. And this would be an example, though, of a certain story of history that we are designing history into relative to our interpretation and understanding of the human condition. And that would be a judgment, and for Mr. White, that would be a problem. But the other thing that ends up happening, if you have a certain story of how humans come into existence, humanity comes into an existence, and that's following an efficient history hypothesis or a idea that rationality is what guides human action, well, then you're going to think of the society you live in as a product of rationality. You're going to also kind of think that whatever is rational in the end is what emerges, what rises to the top. And as a result, maybe you're going to be less intentional or less active about bringing about the best future. Maybe you're going to think that everything's just going to take care of itself in the end and you don't have to worry about it. So, if global warming is a problem, then an efficient history hypothesis could lead you to think that you don't need to really do anything about global warming, really, because history is going to work it all out. And of course, that could be a problem. So there's a certain narrative there that White wants to bring out. He's also going to talk about how in the past civilization would define itself in terms of the civilized versus the uncivilized, and the civilized person was the one who was, say, part of the society, while everyone outside of it was the wild man or the savage. And he's going to go through all the different anthropological understandings of the wild man and the noble savage and the savage and all these different things. But the main idea is that based on how we interpreted what constituted being wild or savage, we could interpret ourselves as civilized. And so right there's an example of a narrative that we're using to determine the nature of our civilization and, who we are and what constitutes wild. And, what wildness, barbaricism, and then objectivity itself is another kind of narrative. All of these are examples of stories which we tell ourselves and form ourselves according to, making it seem as if they were always true, when really we may have simply made them always appear true. And so there's narratives we use to design civilization that then, in the act of making civilization as such, we simultaneously hide the fact that it was a story that gave rise to civilizations. And White, very interestingly enough, will talk about how when you had civilizations that defined the wild man, well, I guess it's the savage, the barbarian. The barbarian is outside of civilization. Well, then as Christianity come about, and everyone could be a sinner, well, that led to an increased existential tension because anyone in society could be wild. You couldn't clearly draw the line between the barbarian and the civilized, because if sin exists in the hearts of all people, then anyone could be wild. And so civilization changed. Society changed relative to this new existential reality. It created new equality, new possibilities of equality, because the rich man could be a sinner just as much as the poor man, but it also increased the existential tension, which that existential tension may also contribute to us being incentivized to see science or scientific objectivity where it is not, because science can give us a existential stability, because it can just give us the facts, and it's less nerve-wracking. Wherever there's interpretation, there's existential instability, because it's not solid. We have to do the work to make it solid, or to make it more, to be confident in it. Where there is not certainty, there's only confidence at best, but confidence is established only through a lot of work. So these are examples that Mr. White's going through to show that civilization is storied, and that means it's interpreted. It's a result of interpretation, and then he's going to go through Foucault and talk about how Foucault also gives us an understanding of civilization and the person according to stories of who is the criminal, what is sex, all these different things. So story plays a big role, and of course story is not scientific. So, it's presented to us as objective truth through history, but really it is a story through interpretation. That doesn't mean it's false. In fact, it's unavoidable. And it can be true, so it's not necessarily that we're doomed, that what's unavoidable is something that's going to doom us, but it does mean that what's unavoidable is something that if it's not going to doom us, we're going to have to work at, which is kind of Hegelian. The history is progressive in Hegel, but it's also contingent, meaning that if we don't do the work we need to do, the phenomenological journey, as Dr. Cadell discusses, and everyone should take his class that's coming out. Everyone should take a philosophy portal. I highly suggested. But anyway, if we don't do the philosophical journey, even though history is progressive, it could collapse instantaneously. So if we really need to take what White is telling us about interpretation quite seriously, because if we do not, we're probably not going to do a good job with the phenomenological journey that Hegel presents us with. But then, it's kind of funny. White is then going to move into the wonderful and extraordinary Foucault, and for Foucault, to sum up his thought quickly, if it's made by human beings, humans can know it. But if it's made by God, we cannot know it. So, Foucault is critiquing Newton, the idea that we can get in. He finds it kind of what Newton is doing in science often kind of heretical, because you're suggesting that we can know the mind of God. And Foucault wants to suggest that if it's made, we can know it. So interpretation is created. Interpretation is made. So far from the acknowledging that everything is all understanding is a product of interpretation, far from that meaning that it's all relativist nonsense, that means it's actually understandable. And it would also mean, following Vico, that the effort to make history a science is the effort to make history unknowable, something we cannot know. So it's a funny move. So, White has gone through this extensive effort to be like, well, interpretation is unavoidable. Interpretation is very difficult. We have to be interdisciplinary. We can't just fall into certainty. We have to learn how to build confidence, which is existential, and all that is very difficult. And then he goes through showing how society formulates long stories. He goes through Foucault. But then he gets here and he's like, but guys, this isn't, the alternative is to know nothing. The alternative is to make history something that would be beyond us. And again, there's a real sense in which that's true if, in fact, what humans live is events, as we already stated, instead of collections of facts. If, indeed, history was collections of facts, there's a real sense in which it would not be something we could relate to or incorporate into our lives. So there is a sense that even if we don't fully accept what Foucault is saying, but there is a sense that it's precisely because of interpretation that we can understand history as events and therefore make them things we can relate to and understand. So he's made these moves. Mr. White has made these moves, and then he brings it to the end of his collection, where it can be said, I just find it splendid, this last essay on the absurdist moment, because after kind of saying everything is, interpretation is paramount, therefore all understanding has something literary about it, he then kind of argues that literary criticism is in disarray today. It's almost like anything goes. So it's like, this final essay is so funny to me, and it is almost kind of a literary Harold Bloom irony in of itself, because he's gone through this whole collection basically claiming that interpretation is everything for understanding, and in this last one he wants to say that the state of literary criticism is not very good, that literary criticism is not up to the task, which is just a very funny move. It's almost like he's deconstructed his whole essay collection at the very end. Or another way to look at it, if we take deconstruction to be the pre-work for reconstruction, the making of a clearing so we can build something new, as I think Derrida intended, well, then we can see this last essay saying, all right, we've argued that interpretation is paramount. We've established that literary criticism, though, is not doing very well. But precisely because we've argued that literary criticism is paramount, there is incentive now to do something about literary criticism. There is now motivation to go in there and fix it and to make it right. And that's a more positive way to interpret the end of this collection. Davood Gozli had this great line where he said, I am plot, therefore I am historically self-conscious, which I just thought was a great way to sum up Hayden White. I am plot, therefore I am. And I think that gets at what Mr. White wants to say, that if we understand, if we are conscious, then there is implotment going on. And that means there's interpretation and judgment. But interpretation does not mean there's no possibility of understanding. It simply means that we have work to do. And we have to do that work, and we need to do that work, because the alternative is basically ignorance and a lack of holding the world together, of having meaning. So we need to take it on. Life is a life of interpretation. If we're alive, we are going to be interpreting, but it's precisely because life can be interpreted that there's space to believe that it is non-interpreted. So there's space in there to interpret it as a science in the way that Mr. White has warned us we should not. But again, at the same time, interpretation adds life. It's what makes life alive, because it's what can make things closer to events and meaningful. Where there is life, there's interpretation, and so to choose life is to choose interpretation. In Mr. White arguing that history will not be properly studied until we learn the art of interpretation, he's also arguing that it's a way to make history alive. Yes, this could risk turning history into a subject that serves our ideologies and personal agendas, and he talked about that, and it was noted in the novel Historian that the risk of interpretation is that that means we can make it ideological, but then he argues that if we don't accept interpretation, it is going to be ideological, and we're not going to realize it, and we're not going to fight it. So this isn't, again, a temptation of turning history into a science is to avoid ideology. But White just simply points out that this only seems to avoid ideology. You have to actively fight ideology in a dialectical structure, as talked about in the novel Historian. Because we're going to interpret, whether we like it or not. In the likelihood of us doing it well, if we are not conscious of its role, will be low. As life is a life of interpretation, life is a life of risk. But where there is risk, there is also an opportunity for us to rise to the occasion. And Mr. White has given us the tools and the imperative to rise to the occasion. And the question is simply, what will we do now? For more by Davood Gozli, check out his YouTube page. The discussion series was a delight. You'll find the whole playlist there. You'll find a playlist on John David's YouTube channel. Both gentlemen are tremendous book reviewers. I highly suggest their work. We're going to be doing Existential Monday next, which will be a delight, by Fontaine. And for more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.